evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Carrie Marsh, and I'm the director of the Clarke Historical Library. The Clarke Speaker Series is one of the Clarke's signature programs, and we're pleased you're joining us here this evening. So let's begin by acknowledging that today we are here on the beautiful lands maintained for generations by the Anishinaabe people, the indigenous inhabitants of Michigan, with whom we continue to partner today at Central Michigan University. So I have some housekeeping to relate to you. First, this talk is being recorded and the recording will be available for later viewing on campus via CMU's Chipcast. There will be time at the end of the presentation for Q&A, so your microphones are muted and your cameras turned off. So if you'd like to ask a question, type your question into the chat box at any time. You can find the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. I'll read out the questions posted in the chat at the end of the presentation so that Carson can answer them. So looking ahead at the upcoming Clarke Speaker Series events on Monday, March 24th at 7 p.m. in the Opperman Auditorium here in Park Library, historian Norman Krentel will give the Audrey and John Cumming endowed lecture about the Michigan Railway Company, Michigan's most significant electric railway. And on Thursday, March 27th at 3 p.m., not 7, but 3, in the Opperman Auditorium, preservation architect Ron Campbell will trace the history of American kit homes and mail order houses. This talk marks the opening of our 2025 exhibition about the Alad and Company of Bay City, Michigan. So I hope you will join us at both of these events. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, author, angler, and ecologist, Dr. Carson Prichard. So Carson is a Central Michigan University alumnus, having received his PhD in Earth and Ecosystem Science from CMU in 2018. His research in Great Lakes ecology and the fish populations in Lake Huron and Lake Michigan has been published in several peer-reviewed journals. This evening, he'll discuss his 2023 book, The Salmon Capital of Michigan, The Rise and Fall of a Great Lakes Fishery, published by Wayne State University Press in 2023, and share some insights about the impact of the decline of salmon fishing on a small northern Michigan community, Rogers City. So please join me in welcoming back to CMU virtually this evening's speaker, Carson Prichard.
All right, thank you, Carrie. This is a really cool opportunity to be able to come back to CMU, so to speak, and present the research that I did kind of after graduating from CMU. I live in Florida now, so this was one of the last things that I worked on before I moved out of Michigan, and I turned it into a book actually while I lived in Florida. Let's see here. So for a time, the salmon capital of Michigan was Rogers City. And if we take a look at the map, we'll see that Rogers City sits on the very northeast shoulder of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, on the shores of Lake Huron. It's about as far away from a major highway or any of Michigan's major metropolitan areas as you can get on this side of the Mackinac Bridge. From Mount Pleasant, it's about a 3-hour drive. Without a doubt, the largest influence on the history of Rogers City has been the natural resources, including forestry and the Great Lakes fisheries. But foremost of all has been the limestone quarry up there called calcite. It's the world's largest limestone quarry, and both the mine and the shipping fleet that operated out of calcite have been major employers and economic influences on Rogers City and Presque County. Many of those jobs have been eliminated over time with advances in technology and mechanization, contributing to a population decline in Rogers City. In 2023, its population was just over 2,900, down from a peak of more than 4,700 in 1960. Just to get a kind of scale look at the size of calcite, especially relative to Rogers City, you see that calcite, the property over which the quarry extends is about 3 to 4 square miles, while Rogers City is between 1 and 2 square miles. So I'd like to kind of, before I get into the book, begin by saying that it's the final product of an oral history research project that I began in 2021. And my original goal was to document the experiences all around Lake Huron regarding this thing that I thought was really interesting, which was the collapse of the Chinook salmon fishery there. My background, primarily, I identify as an angler, and I began as a freshman at Grand Valley State University in 2005, and my friend base became, salmon and steelhead anglers, and we fished Lake Michigan and the tributaries to Lake Michigan. And from 2005, on through my bachelor's degree, I kind of became a really avid salmon and steelhead angler and had no idea that on the other side of the state, Lake Huron's salmon fishery may have been bigger and better than what I was experiencing in Lake Michigan. But by the time I started salmon and steelhead fishing, Lake Huron's Chinook salmon fishery had collapsed. And so my interest in what the story of what happened on Lake Huron is kind of what compelled me to do this research and focus on the people. But while I wasn't able to get that larger research project funded, where I would have gotten stories from all around Lake Huron and even in Ontario, that allowed me to focus in on Rogers City in a way that I otherwise probably wouldn't have. And I feel really fortunate, in retrospect, that that's how things played out. And so in keeping with the oral history nature of the book, the presentation will be a collaboration, so to speak, among myself and the people that I interviewed, the Rogers City community members, by using audio clips of my interviews with them. Now, if you've read the book, you know that its arrangement is different from most other books. It alternates between my own personal narrative and then large, unedited, and uncut quotations from the interviews. And I chose to do this to present the collective history in the most representative manner that I could, with the least influence of interpretation by me on what the reader would read. I strive to remain really true to the source in the book. So among the 19 hours of interviews that I recorded with participants regarding their memories of the salmon fishery and its influence and legacy on Rogers City, several major themes emerged, and those are kind of what became the chapters of the book. So this shows a screenshot that I want to point out that the full interview recordings that you'll hear from this presentation, as well as everything that was quoted in the book, is available online through the Library of Michigan's database called Michiganology. And the name of the collection, if you wanted to search for it, is Oral History of the Rogers City Chinook Salmon Recreational Fishery. And so now I'm going to begin by playing clips from the interviews. And this first set of clips takes us back to the 1960s and 70s, around the time of the initial introduction of Pacific salmon to the Great Lakes.
I happened to grow up about a block from our small boat harbor. And I fished. We were on the lake. Up until that point, there wasn't a whole lot of big sport fishing in the big lake. My dad always said when he was a kid, which was, of course, many years before that, the lake wasn't good for anything more than a darn cold swim. And that was just, nobody really fished it. There were lake trout and things out there. Of course, the salmon population came in later. And so I saw that evolve.
The local boys snagged them out of the rivers. And when I first came here, the fellow that I bought the store from lived on Linden, which is a street that the Trout River runs next to out to the lake. And I saw 3 boys on bikes, and they had 2 salmon on each handlebar, and the fish were dragging on the street, and they were riding home.
So you came in 83, 84. That was right around the time where the big initiative to stock
just started.
Yeah.
They did some Akiak river stocking and I believe around 67. And I think it was around 68, 69, we started being able to harvest some of the jacks and the early spawners in the Akiak River. And that kind of started it all. And it kind of went that way for quite a while. And then the population just kept growing and growing. And to go to the river and catch a 30-pound fish was just, I mean, it was just normal. And most of us got our limit and left and came back tomorrow, or when the weekend was over, you went back downstate and lived till the next time you could get back up.
But there were just plentiful salmon in the rivers. And then it was probably 1972 or so that we, anyway, started really going out in the lake and finding out that, wow, what a great sport fish this salmon is in the lake. It was quite a bit different than just trying to haul them out of the river. I mean, that was fun, but you get out in the lake and start fishing salmon. It was terrific. So that was a real peak time in the 70s for salmon fishing in the Rogers City area.
The 70s, you say then?
Yes, all through the 70s was really good in the Rogers City area.
Oh, okay. So that's before really the major stocking.
We went out regularly all through the 70s, and it was a very good time for salmon fishing. And then it just kept getting better as those years went on. But yeah, we had great salmon fishing all through the 70s.
Many people in northern Michigan's first observations and experiences with salmon happened in the Akiak River, which is just a short drive north of Rogers City and enters Lake Huron and Hammond Bay. But the rivers and creeks of all of northern Michigan provide really excellent spawning habitat for salmon. And within a few generations, salmon began spawning throughout tributaries to the northern portions of Lakes Michigan and Huron. And anglers in Rogers City began to really figure out that the salmon fishery lent itself well to the Rogers City area. Because the water in Lake Huron gets deep fairly close to shore, and the prevailing westerly winds keep the waves to a minimum and push the warmer surface water from the shallows away from shore, it makes the habitat that salmon prefer, as well as alewives and smelt that they like to eat, really accessible to fishermen and even small 14-foot boats, as well as from shore and from the breakwall of the harbor. Anglers in Rogers City in the early 1980s began advocating to the state for increased salmon stocking in the Rogers City area because they argued to the Michigan DNR that it would be better bang for their buck. The fish that were stocked here would survive, and they would generate more fishing as compared to salmon that would be stocked anywhere else in the state. The concern, though, was that stocking more fish in obvious places like the Akiak River would generate too much more trespassing, littering, and snagging of salmon, which had been made illegal. But it just so happened that Swan River, which is basically a creek that runs through calcite property and is entirely off limits to the public, makes for a really great place to stock salmon and then also keep away the riffraff, the negative aspects that would come with stocking so many salmon in a publicly accessible place. Furthermore, the state could set up a temporary weir on the river and capture the fish and then use that site as a place to collect eggs from returning salmon and further maintain their hatchery program. So the state of Michigan so liked the set of circumstances in Rogers City that they offered to Rogers City, they proposed to stock 900,000 to 1 million salmon there every year beginning in 1983 to create a salmon fishery that they said would range from the Straits of Mackinac to Saginaw Bay and Lake Huron. And just to put this in perspective, during the peak production of Chinook salmon by the hatcheries, the state of Michigan, they were raising and stocking about 4 million Chinook salmon statewide. So Rogers City was slated to get roughly a quarter of the state's entire Chinook salmon production. This is a picture of one of those stocking events in 1983 on the banks of the Swan River and calcite property. Pictured on top left is Frank Christ and his wife Teresa and Frank's brother. Also in the picture, biologist Steve Swan and Harry Whiteley. This is a picture of the temporary weir that would be set up on Swan River in the fall to capture the salmon as they made their spawning migrations back up the river. So the fence going across the river is like a permeable barrier, permeable to water. And then this chute comes from a pen that was created upstream of the weir, and the salmon follow their natural tendency to move up current and jump through rapids in order to be captured in this pen or corral. And here you can see the tail fins and dorsal fins of probably hundreds of Chinook salmon that were caught in that pen, where they're waiting to either sexually mature and have their gametes collected to create fertilized eggs that would be sent to the hatcheries, or over time, various commercial entities had, claims to the salmon. They would fillet them and turn them into various types of food. So on the heels of the state's salmon stocking focus in Rogers City, some community members in Rogers City pushed to begin a salmon fishing tournament to line up with the time when the big 3-year-old adult Chinook salmon from that first, million salmon stocking event would begin to show up in large numbers in August of 1986. And so this next set of sound clips describes the buildup to the first couple Rogers City salmon tournaments.
86 is when it started.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a resident here, Mike, his name was Mike Podrensky.
Yeah.
And Mike was in the Air Force and he was stationed in Oscoda, but he was from Rogers City. And he wrote a couple books on steelhead fishing in the rivers. And when this hit in his hometown, he was excited, but he was an intelligence officer down in Oscoda. He'd run up here for the weekends. But he was part of the Michigan Outdoor Writers Association. And I give Mike all the credit for the tournament here because he had the experience how to build one. But they weren't prepared for it. I'm telling you, they were lying almost out to 23. What do we do with all these boats?
Yeah, in the old days, they used to do a Le Mans start, a running start, and they'd fire off this.
Well, Mike said he was the one who fired the shotgun.
Yeah, he used to be down there officiating, and that was quite a nothing but assholes and elbows and people running all over the place.
They were called nobody drowned,
Yeah.
But we'd go down. I several times. I'm not sure, 2 or 3 times. I did the shotgun start. Get out on the break wall, and I think it was 6:30. I'm not sure now at the time, but when the time came, fired that shotgun, and it was unreal to hear those engines roar up. You could hear it all over Rogers City. Those engines. There were so many boats, and they were fighting to get out of the harbor, which was dangerous at the time because there was too many boats for the harbor. So eventually, they moved the starting point into the lake so they didn't have to compete with that entrance to get an exit to get out of that harbor. It was actually, the small boats were in danger, there's no question about it, but fortunately we never had any incidents. But it was hazardous, to say the least, for all those boats to get moving at one time.
Mm-hmm.
But when they fired up all those engines, it was a roar.
Well, we can win that tournament. We only need to catch one good fish. There's nothing to it. So we got in this 14-foot boat and went out here and went fishing. Well, there was a few more boats around in the 80s. The first time we went out in the evening, we pulled out of the harbor and everybody made a left turn out of the harbor. They trolled down to Seagull Point, went out to about 100 feet and went back around, trolled over to Adams Point, and then came back up along the shoreline to the harbor. And that was the pattern. It was like a big parade out there that night. And when it got dark, here was this whole line of lights on the boats. Well, that was my first experience out there. We didn't catch a fish, but we learned real quickly you didn't want to go the opposite direction of anybody. Everybody was mad at you.
That first tournament, were you the only boat that was in Swan Bay doing what you were doing?
Oh God, there was so many boats in there that it's unbelievable. You would not believe. There had to be, I couldn't even, that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a long time ago. There was so many boats, I've never seen so many boats, okay? There's so many boats, there was 35, 40 boats anyway. And they had spotter boats out, because I talked to one guy that was in a spotter boat. They're just checking to make sure nobody's doing anything wrong, and they're going, wow, you guys are catching fish like crazy. And the funny thing was, it was an onshore wind. It was windier than a bugger, and everything was riled up.
So we made a pass in there. We nailed 2 fish right off the gate. One time, that guy that was in there came up on a wave. When he came down, he bottomed out right on the.
Really?
Oh yeah, it was bad. Those waves were huge. There were waves as big as this ceiling in here. It's big waves crashing in there. So it was really crazy. But we made, I don't remember how many passes. I don't remember if we had 5 or 6 fish. I don't remember what it was off the top of my head. But then we made the long trek to go, because we had to weigh them back. We had to weigh those fish in, so we had to go back to the harbor. We couldn't stay and then carry our fish over there. So it was kind of an interesting ride back going over those waves. And we got back there, and then all of a sudden we take the leader. Now we're ahead of the game. We got the first place fish, we're in first place in the boat tournament. Well, everyone got off the lake.
We came in on that salmon tournament, and we quit at 19 because I knew we had 19, but I didn't want to make a mistake. So we're going to quit one short. And we came in, and it was getting close to quitting time anyway, because I think that was a Sunday 1 o'clock cutoff, and we had to get back. But we came in. People asked, what did you catch them on? I show them this little chrome grizzly. I said, 18 of our 19 fish came on this. Bullshit. Bullshit. I says, this was a brand new lure. I took it out of the package this morning. Brand new lure. Look at it. It is just carved up with teeth marks. Look at it. This was a brand new lure this morning. Bullshit. What can I tell you? What can I tell you?
For me, it was really exciting reading back through the back issues of Presque County Advance in 1986 during the buildup of that first Rogers City Salmon Tournament. And if you think about it, it was a really big unknown how well that major stocking would pan out. And the methods to troll for salmon in the Great Lakes were still developing. And although the weather was really dicey for those first 2 Rogers City Salmon tournaments, the salmon returns and the fishing would have to be described as better than anyone could have predicted. And I had so much fun listening to Ken and his wife Mandy Partika describe their stories from fishing in the heyday. Ken was the kind of boat captain of the winning boat of the first 2 tournaments. We were sitting on top of a wooden picnic table in his backyard, which is right on Lake Huron, and we had the sound of the waves kind of touching the shoreline. And when I called Ken on the phone to see if he wanted to participate, he told me that he is not the type of person that really liked to say a whole lot. He didn't know if he had anything to say. So for him to tell me that, and then we had no problem spending 3 hours sitting on that picnic table talking about the salmon fishery, a case of Stroh's beer between us, which is what he likes to drink. And so the tournament came to be a really big deal in Rogers City, and it occurred the weekend before the Nautical Festival, which is kind of like, and still is probably the biggest tourism draw to Rogers City. So the two kind of went hand in hand in a lot of people's memories. But anyway, this is probably my favorite quote that I came across in my research, which is from the cover page article following the 1997 tournament. So imagine 1,548 salmon weighing in excess of 20,000 pounds. That is how much fish was pulled out of Presque County waters over the weekend by participants in the 12th annual Rogers City Salmon Tournament. And I remember getting to this page and thinking, you know, how long did it take to fillet all those fish? And then what did they do with all the carcasses? But the fishing really was phenomenal in Lake Huron and Rogers City, and not just at the tournaments. And it stayed good through the early 2000s. Some of the fish caught in Rogers City were real monsters by any standards in the Great Lakes, Pacific Northwest, really anywhere. Here's a picture of one that went just under 33 pounds. This is like the second biggest one that I came across. It's a 38 pounder that was caught in Swan Bay. This is a 31 pounder that was caught by a teenager. And then this is a 30 pounder that was caught the weekend following the tournament, and had it been caught the weekend before during the tournament, it would have been a tournament winner. So that kind of then brings me to the subtitle of the book, The Rise and Fall of a Great Lakes Fishery. And so while it was my curiosity about the negative effects on people of the alewife and salmon collapse in Lake Huron, you know, from my conversations with people in Rogers City, the emphasis was much more on what had been the positive aspects of the fishery over the years. And many people that I spoke to were reluctant when it came to the term crash, and people often pushed back against claims that salmon were no longer in Lake Huron. But I do believe there's a lot of evidence for a Chinook salmon population crash in Lake Huron in the mid-2000s. Biologists trying to understand this ecological phenomenon were quick to realize that alewives had essentially disappeared from the lake. And alewives are a small herring species. They're invasive to the Great Lakes. They're native to the Atlantic Ocean, and they gained access to the Great Lakes with the building of canals that bypass Niagara Falls. And in most years, they were the main prey of Chinook salmon. And so the initial explanation of the salmon population crash was that the salmon had become so abundant that their consumption of alewives outpaced the alewives' ability to replace themselves. And now, decades later, kind of later understanding of the massive ecosystem changes in Lake Huron places more emphasis on the invasions of zebra and then especially quagga mussels for redirecting how energy flows through in Lake Huron. So zebra and quagga mussels are benthic organisms, meaning they sit on the bottom. And energy in Lake Huron, you know, begins from photosynthesis by phytoplankton at the surface. And during the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when the salmon were kind of the dominant predator in Lake Huron, the pathway of energy through Lake Huron was much different. Phytoplankton at the surface were consumed by zooplankton. Those were consumed by alewives and smelt, and those fed the salmon. Now, with the introduction and proliferation of zebra and quagga mussels on the bottom, the zebra and quagga mussels filter feed the phytoplankton, and then they kind of transfer that energy to the bottom. and it doesn't have the same pathways that it used to have through the zooplankton and then the alewives that it used to have. And so really the invasion and proliferation of zebra and quagga mussels has been, said to have had more of an impact on the collapse of alewife and salmon. No one tells the story of the changes, the ecological and the fishery changes of Lake Huron better than retired Michigan DNR biologist Jim Johnson. And so I encourage anyone really interested in this story to listen to my original interview with him. But this next set of clips that I'll share captures some of what the people in Rogers City saw during what I'm calling the crash.
Yeah, I never had any type of thought of it going away. I just, I planned, I could have moved out of the state. I could have took jobs other places. Family and salmon fishing kept me here. It really did. And there's a lot of other contributors, but I never foresee the so-called crash of the salmon. There was no thought in my mind whatsoever. I actually wanted to charter fish. And pretty confident I could make a good living off that. But other jobs kind of sidetracked me a little bit. But then, the salmon fishing started declining a little bit when I was really interested in doing that. And then there was a scare and a worry that, wow, what's going on here?
You knew something was happening, okay? Because for a while you had a fish that was 30 inches long, 35 inches long. It was close to 40 pounds. In 3 or 4 years, that fish that was the same length was 17 pounds.
And people began to panic in 2004. I mean, here we're getting the big heads, skinny bodies, they're looking horrible. And if you think about it, up until 2002, actually going into 2003, people were happy. See, the people really didn't have anything to point to. You do now. You can point to Lake Huron. Look what happens if you have too many predators.
Now it's a whole different fishery. I mean, things have changed drastically on a number of fronts. Certainly invasive species has had a big impact. The collapse of the alewife has really hampered the ability for the salmon to thrive. Lake trout have adapted to eating gobies. There's some smelt now, I think, but it's just completely different. In my lifetime, to see an ecological shift like that is just phenomenal.
The data from the annual Rogers City Salmon Tournament also speaks strongly to the collapse, both in terms of participation in the tournament and the size of the winning fish. So on this graph, the blue dots correspond with the left axis and depict the number of boats that participated in the tournament. And the red line is the size of the winning fish and corresponds to the right axis. And as you can see, the tournament built up, reaching between 300 to 360 boats for much of the 90s, and the winning fish often exceeding 30 pounds as late as 2002. But as you can see, by the mid-2000s, the stats that had been pretty stable for over a decade declined rapidly. Another quirky stat that mirrors the decline is the weight of fish that had to be hauled from the fish cleaning station at the marina in Rogers City. So in 1996, the marina got a multi-million-dollar upgrade, and along with that, they got a new fish cleaning station, and it had an industrial-strength garbage disposal called a fish grinder that allowed anglers to fillet their fish and dispose of the guts and carcasses essentially into the city's wastewater system. However, the fish waste created such an organic load on the small city's sewer system that the fish cleaning station would actually be locked and shut down by July or August, kind of right as the salmon fishing season was picking up. And as Rob Cortman, a gentleman who worked at the wastewater treatment plant, told me, the Department of Public Works would put barrels out in front of the boarded up fish cleaning station set up tables, and then the anglers would fillet their fish, put the carcasses in these barrels, and then they would have to be carted once or twice a day to pits dug on calcite property to be buried. So that's kind of what had to go on when the salmon fishing was good. But by 2008, the volume of like fish entrails that was being caught was so low that the fish cleaning station could remain open, and the city's wastewater treatment plant could handle the organic load that was contributed by the fish carcasses. So for this presentation, like the book, it's been challenging to distill decades worth of experiences and memories into a nice, clean summarization. And it's not that I would want to do that anyway, because I think it's the diversity of experience, and then the reader or the listener kind of hearing that diversity of the experience and then coming to their own kind of personal conclusions is what really makes oral history powerful and useful. This final collection of clips presents some of the reflections on the history of the salmon fishery and its legacy on Rogers City.
Some would say that the loss of the salmon, the DNR could have done more to prevent that by cutting back stocking more quickly, but I don't think that's politically feasible. And in hindsight now, with the bottom-uppers argument becoming more and more persuasive, I don't think the DNR could have done anything to stop the alewife collapse in Lake Huron. It was going to happen.
And it just created an energy. It just created an energy that right now we're quite honestly in the process of determining how to get it back. So the fishery brought the energy, and that's always how it was. And just again, both locally and with visitors, just a lot of vibrancy that we don't quite have since the fishery has become more diminished.
I drive through those towns all the time and just always go down to the marina, you know, like every port that I go through, Oscoda, Alpena, Rogers City, the smaller towns too, take a walk out on the beach, and how quiet it is there was kind of a weird feeling compared to previously. Like I'd worked out here in the 90s, early 90s, when the salmon fishery was just going crazy, and how busy the towns were due to the fishing activity. And there'd be people lined along the banks and stuff, you know, and that's pretty rare to see anymore.
Here, I mean, people just dealt with it. What else can you do?
Mm-hmm. So then when everything started to go away, you know, with the mussels and everything, you know, the fishery just started to decline, they didn't really, you know, well, they didn't really seem to care if it went away or not. You know, there was people that were almost glad that you didn't have all these boat trailers up and down the streets and everything. And
we can gobs of stuff, and we like to do that too. You know, you don't have to fish every day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you go and you get your canner done. You come down to the beach, and it's ooh, let's take a little dunk and have a little fire and grill something up, and it's not all salmon anymore, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just our bag. I mean, we played the game. I loved it. But I'm not going to say bored with it. I mean, how can you get bored?
Because that salmon fishing went away, it's not like it created this void in Rogers City, or...
I don't think so, because the people that are still here, there's a few of them that fish for salmon. Like I said, maybe 40 boats on a good a good season. That's not a lot of people, you know, that's,
Okay.
I don't think that the salmon fishing is, if it were recoverable, it'd be great for people that like to fish.
Mhm.
And it might be, again, great for the economy on a limited basis, but that's not going to do much for the employees at Calcite who don't work anymore and the other employment situation.
And actually, I know quite a few people that I've met and been in contact with that's the reason they moved up here. You know, they retired, moved up here because the fishery, they fall in love with the area. You know, they stayed even though the fishing went south.
The salmon fishery brought in outsiders, like my family, and some stayed. And that was to the good. I also think it put the city in this whole region on the state's radar for grant assistance, and it helped the state take our area seriously, which it had not been. It was a very internal kind of, you know, it didn't need any help when you had the sugar daddy U.S. Steel taking care of everything. But when that, you're left high and dry, now you got to learn how to write a grant and build a relationship with the state agencies, which the fisheries really did help do. It highlighted the community as a lake-based economy, but not necessarily just about fish. You know, about resorts, about bike trails and parks, about the underwater sanctuary. So it expanded the identity of the community rather than changing it, which I think was good. And it helped change the character of the place from just being a quarry town to something bigger. Again, it never took over the identity, and I think it was crazy, people that thought it would or could or should. It led to, I think, other types of recreation being considered as positives, and not either or but both. So it kind of built up a more complex community character. And it really forced a recognition of a disrupted and complex lake ecosystem that hasn't been resolved and may never be resolved, but at least.
So with that, I'd like to thank all of the people that shared their stories with me and are included in the book. And I look forward to trying to answer questions that you may have. But before I do that, I'll close with a reading from the final chapter of the book. I want to discuss the title, Salmon Capital of Michigan, because I find it to be a peculiar concept. To some, Rogers City was once the salmon capital of Michigan. But unlike political capitals, which might be supplanted or relocated, the title describing Michigan's premier salmon fishery has been neither assumed by nor bestowed upon another Michigan coastal community. There's been no heir to the throne. From what I can tell, the experience in Rogers City was a somewhat unique phenomenon that represented an exaggerated version of a similar salmon fishing scenario experienced throughout many Great Lakes port towns. But being the salmon capital was not an achievement or status that the people in Rogers City with whom I spoke paraded around or even seemed to care much about. While the term originated in the mid-1980s as a publicity tool to draw tourism to Rogers City, it wasn't an identity that was held onto by people there. And so I think my use of the term as a title for this book should not be interpreted as how the people who shared their stories with me actually feel about the history of salmon fishing in Rogers City. However, to be a capital of anything depends upon the so-called capital's relation to other places. And many of the Rogers City residents who fish Lake Huron never really fish the Great Lakes anywhere else. My point is that the perception of Rogers City as a salmon fishing capital is best left to an outsider. I feel that Rogers City truly must have been the salmon capital of Michigan, and I hope that the stories told within this oral history project preserve the best of which that title represented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carson. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat. I do have one question, the first one to kick it off, which is you did an oral history, and had you ever thought about doing something like this when you were studying Earth and Ecosystems series, or did you have a model that inspired you to pursue an oral history as a way to investigate this?
Well, it's kind of a multifaceted thing, but the short story is no, I hadn't thought of doing an oral history until after I graduated with my PhD in fisheries biology, essentially. I found myself more interested in like the human aspects of fisheries than I guess the ecology or the fisheries biology. And that was in like 2018. But I had always been thinking about, what happened to all those port towns that I don't really know much about on, the east side of Michigan. They're not as prominent to me as like Ludington, Manistee, Holland, Grand Haven. And I used to go to Frankfurt and Grand Haven and see all the boats that would come out of there to fish for salmon all summer long. And I thought about all of the energy that was there and, probably tourism and money. And so what must have happened on Lake Huron when all that went away? And, with this project those thoughts in mind, I took a class. I asked Dr. Brittany Fremian in the history department at CMU if she would teach me, her class on oral history over the summer. And because my idea was, well, I have these research ideas that I'm interested in. Maybe I can write my own grants and do this study where I try to find and interview people that experienced that collapse and tell that story. So that's what I did, and I got a small grant from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, which was a pilot project, and I became connected to people in the Michigan DNR, and then ultimately Frank Christ, who is somebody who lives in Rogers City, but also is an active participant as like a community member and advocate in meetings that the Great Lakes Fisheries agencies would hold. And he was like, you really ought to focus on Rogers City. This is where this big stocking initiative happened. And, we still have a great fishery here. And so, I guess I just got fortunate that they funded that project and that I, was able to contact so many people that were willing to share their story or connect me with people that were willing to share their story. And it was really the participation of others that made it all possible. And the book was just something that came as a result of me feeling like I have to, this has to be shared in like a format or a platform that can reach more people than just the interview recordings themselves. And I felt like I owed it to the people that took the time to talk with me to share their story, because I just thought it was really worth sharing.
Well, thank you. We're going to come back to the interviewees in a second, but one of the questions that we have is, what was the main reason for the collapse? And it sounds like maybe there's still a rich fishery there, so is it fair to call it a collapse?
Well, so alewife definitely collapsed in Lake Huron. And like I was trying to describe, well, maybe we'll take a step back. The fisheries of the Great Lakes are nothing like they were 100, 150 years ago. They're to a large degree comprised of non-native species. And as a result of that, the lakes are constantly kind of adjusting to these new species. There's over 180 aquatic invasive species just in the Great Lakes overall. And so if we go back before salmon and before, they were introduced in the late 60s, we had commercial fishing in the Great Lakes, as well as the creation of, the Welland Canal. And so you had sea lamprey, which are a parasitic fish that gained access to the Great Lakes, that the native species like lake trout were not adapted to. And so sea lamprey largely killed off and eliminated the predator fish from Lakes Michigan and Huron. And as a result, without a predator, these other invasive species, rainbow smelt and alewives, became the major, fish biomass in the lakes. They're not native; they're native to the Atlantic Ocean. And so in the 50s and early 60s, the state was wondering, well, what do we do with all these alewives? They're dying every year. They're washing up on the shore in 4-foot windrows. And, they described this in Rogers City. It happened in Lake Michigan, in Chicago and Grand Haven. They'd take, bulldozers and bulldoze piles of alewife off of the beaches. And so salmon were introduced for two reasons. One, to create a recreational fishery, and also keep the populations of alewives low enough so that they weren't a nuisance. And so what happened in Lake Huron is that salmon were introduced and they adapted really well. And the natural reproduction of salmon ultimately far outweighed the stocking of salmon in terms of the contribution of young fish to adult fish. And there got to be so many adult salmon in Lake Huron that they collapsed the alewife base. At the same time as the salmon got to be so numerous that they could have that effect, the amount of food available for alewives to eat was also being reduced greatly by the zebra and quagga mussels, which are small mussels that live on the bottom and filter feed out phytoplankton, or like single-celled algae that used to be eaten by the things that alewives and smelt ate. So the alewives kind of got hit from the top and the bottom in the food web, and once they collapsed, it had this other effect of being really favorable for native predator species in Lake Huron, lake trout and walleye, which recovered. And that's a story in and of itself, and it's told in the book and also by Jim Johnson in my interview with him. But with the collapse of alewife, the native predators, lake trout and walleye, recovered, and there got to be so many lake trout and walleye that even if alewife had a good reproductive event, they would be eaten by the lake trout and walleye. And so the alewife population essentially can't recover in Lake Huron.
And then for the salmon?
Well, without the alewife, the salmon are just so one-dimensional in how they feed. They're just looking for prey in the right temperature zone and in the right part of the water column, that they're not able to adapt to the native prey species in Lake Huron or the other now major prey species in Lake Huron, which is round goby, which live right on the bottom. Salmon won't really feed right on the bottom.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up and giving us all the details of the fishery and how it's changed over the past 60 years, 70 years. Our next question is about the interviewees. Were they eager to talk to you and tell their stories? Were some slow to warm up to you, the outsider, coming and asking about their fishery?
Yeah, so it was kind of a range of eagerness. Some people spoke with me on the phone and said they really didn't have anything to contribute, even though you talk on the phone with them for 20 minutes. But the process of doing the interviews was pretty involved. I contacted everyone, I explained my interest, and basically, and explained the nature of an oral history, which is, if you think something is important to share, I'm interested in hearing that and recording it for history's sake, and giving voice to people that otherwise wouldn't have a voice, which is like elected officials or state or federal biologists. I wanted to hear from the community members. And so some people were, pretty eager to share their story and on board. And other people, it took more repeated phone calls and meeting with them in person, kind of just explaining what would be the end product of, my recorded conversation with them. But, there was 19 people that contributed interviews. There were probably that many more who, would have been good contributors to the book, but they just weren't, I guess, willing to share their story, or didn't think that they had something worth sharing, and maybe they didn't want to be recorded.
Thank you. When it comes to the lessons learned from the Lake Huron fishery and the collapse for salmon there, are there lessons that can be learned that can be implemented to Lake Michigan to mitigate a potential collapse there?
Well, I think so. And I think what has happened as a result of the collapse in Lake Huron has done a lot to create collaboration and communication among the stakeholders, like the anglers, the angling groups, and the biologists, and the hatcheries, the lawmakers, because there's several things that can be influenced by the state in managing the balance between prey and predators in the lakes, due to how many fish are raised and stocked, or the regulations regarding harvest. So if you want fewer predators, you can stock fewer potentially, or you can allow more to be harvested. And I would say that how closely the prey fish populations are monitored now has been, really enhanced by the circumstances that happened in Lake Huron. And so you currently still have really viable alewife and Chinook salmon populations and fisheries in Lakes Michigan and Ontario. And so they're keenly aware of what, the biologists and the anglers there are keenly aware of what happened in Lake Huron. And they are very carefully monitoring predator and prey populations in Lakes Michigan and Ontario, with the goal of maintaining the salmon fisheries there. So, there's the potential that the salmon fisheries could collapse there too. And so, what happened in Lake Huron is very actively being used. In terms of like the oral history component, or like the human aspect, me personally, and I didn't want to put too much of this in the book, but there's as an angler, or as somebody who was like a biologist but also an angler, I could see the value of a non-native species like Chinook salmon, and then their alewife and rainbow smelt that they ate, in a different way that I think a lot of people who are maybe conservation minded wouldn't see them, because they might say, well, they're non-native, so how bad is it really that they collapse, and now we have better circumstances for native species like lake trout and walleye. And you would hear or see it advocated that, well, maybe it wouldn't be so bad if the salmon fishery in Lake Michigan went away, or the salmon fishery in Lake Ontario went away. And so I was somewhat personally motivated to get the human aspect of what would be the human effects if they went away, because we already have this study in Lake Huron of what would happen, and I just didn't see that that had been documented. And now we're getting 20 some plus years past the collapse, and we're kind of running out of time to document that story. And you know, even some of the people that I have interviewed have since passed away, and there were countless others who would have had stories worth sharing and saving and preserving, that aren't able to because they're not with us anymore. So that was part of my personal motivation, was to document the like the human argument for what would be lost, like culturally, if those fisheries were to go away on Lake Michigan and Ontario.
Thank you very much. So we have one more question here, it looks like, unless maybe another one or two pop in. But the question is about the specifically gobies eat mussels and clams, correct?
They feed on the bottom, and I know that they eat zebra and quagga mussels. They do. So they have, you know, they're both from, well, round gobies and then zebra and quagga mussels. They all come from the Black and Caspian Seas, and they got here from ballast water, from international shipping. And so they have kind of been able to recreate part of their ecology here in the Great Lakes. And so, yeah, the zebra mussels kind of are probably facilitated, or I'm sorry, the round gobies are kind of facilitated by zebra and quagga mussels. And you know, my understanding now is that round gobies are living to a large degree off of quagga mussels, and have also, as people told me in Rogers City, the round gobies have kind of eaten what used to be, you know, expanses of zebra mussels on the bottom. The round gobies have kind of eaten them. So the quagga mussels live in deeper water, and all that is to say that, you know, round gobies are really good food for fish that orient toward the bottom. And lake trout are a native predator species that, while they do come up into the water column, are better at orienting toward the bottom, and have really benefited by having round gobies as now one of their main prey items in Lake Huron and the rest of the Great Lakes.
And then
I don't know if that answers the whole question.
I think so, yeah. And then the Cisco fish, are they also eating mussels?
Cisco, I'm less certain about. So I know there are parts of Lake Huron, like in Georgian Bay and the North Channel, where there are Cisco, and there's efforts to raise Cisco in hatcheries and stock them in Saginaw Bay. Part of the idea being that they would be this mid-size prey fish, that the native species like walleye and lake trout could eat, that would be in that size range that alewife used to, you know, fill. But Cisco are pelagic. My understanding is anyway that they live up in the water column. They swim and they feed up in the water column, not so much on the bottom. Now, I may be a little bit wrong about that, but I don't know enough about Cisco to answer that very well. I have fished for them some. There's actually Cisco that can be caught in parts of Northwest Michigan and Lake Michigan, and I've kind of seasonally seen them in Platte Bay and of Charlevoix. And it may be the case that they can feed off the bottom, but I just don't know enough about Cisco to really answer that.
Well, thank you for all the information. It's fantastic. It is about as interdisciplinary as it gets, right? Biology mixed with history. And when you mentioned the idea of the biology and the culture, just a plug for the Clarke Historical Library and the Reed Draper and Robert Corman angling collections that are here at the Clarke, which do a really good job of documenting not only the science, but also the culture and the human aspects of these fisheries and what their impact is across the whole Great Lakes area. So we appreciate you being here.